Okay, hello everybody and welcome to this webinar. This is Kit Dahl. I'm on the council staff. I support the council's fishery ecosystem plan. And this is the third in a series of 4 webinars sponsored by the council as part of the FEP, Fishery Ecosystem Plan initiative on climate and communities, and staff scientists from the NMFS science centers have organized these or put together these presentations over these series of webinars. And so today's webinar topic is distributional changes of West Coast species and impacts of climate change on species and species groups. There are 3 presenters, Eric Ward and Oli Shelton from the Northwest Fishery Science Center and Elliot Hazen from the Southwest Fishery Science Center. Just a few notes, logistical notes here, as you can see on your screen. First of all, at the outset here, the participants are muted, the exception being our ad hoc ecosystem work group, who will be facilitating discussion after and questions after the presentation is finished. We're unmuting those folks. Once we get to the discussion question asking opportunity, you just use the hand raising feature in the GoToMeeting webinar software if you want to ask a question, and that'll be our cue to unmute you. There's a contact person and number if you're having problems with the webinar platform. And that's Sandra Krause. She's here in the room with me, and there's her phone number, 503-752-3732. Just a note, this presentation is being recorded, and in fact, we will be making the recording available on our website as soon as we can, but in any case, within the next few days. And so, if anybody who's on participating today, you can always go back and listen to it again. And then, well, it doesn't really help me to say this, but for those not participating today, they will have a chance to review this webinar at a future time. So with that, I don't have any more introductory remarks. I guess I'll just quickly check with the chair of the Ecosystem Work Group, Yvonne de Renier, see if she has anything she wants to say at the outset. Otherwise, we'll turn the screen over to the presenters.
Thank you, Kit. I don't have any big remarks. I just wanted to check and make sure that Corey Niles, our rapporteur, was able to get on. And other than that, pass it on to the presenters.
Okay, yeah, we see Corey is on the participation list, so we'll turn the screen over and get going with the presentation.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Kit. Hopefully this works. Whoops.
Yeah, we're seeing your desktop and everything. So.
And you see the presentation and everything? Or no?
Yeah.
Okay, great. My only other thing is Elliot is calling in from California, so it'd be good to make sure he is unmuted. He won't be talking for a while, but just so he can jump in when necessary. So that's the only thing I have to have.
Yeah, we have him unmuted, so good to go.
Great, thank you. Well, thanks everybody for calling in. Today, Elliot, Eric, and I are going to be talking about distributional shifts and some recent work for a variety of species in the California current. And we're going to present 3 sort of case studies or examples of ongoing work. But before we do that, we're going to sort of very briefly recap some basic information from an earlier seminar, which is seminar number 1, if you want to go back and look online. And the main point that we want to take here is that we know in the future, or we suspect very strongly that there's going to be substantial changes to the ocean in the near future, right? So this is an example from the Jacox seminar. It's going to be warmer by prediction. Also, there's going to be a fair amount of variability. So any given year may be similar to what we see right now, but more on average, it'll be warmer. Importantly, not only are we expecting climate and heat to change, temperature, we expect a whole bunch of other stuff to change as well. So there's going to be changes to upwelling, there's going to be changes to stratification, there's going to be nutrient changes, hypoxia, ocean acidification. There's a lot going on. A lot of it is uncertain, but we're certain it's going to happen in some way or another. This is all sort of basic bottom-up physics oceanography. From my perspective, we also need to remember that there's other things beyond oceanography, and that distributions are both a function of what is physiologically okay for different species, as well as survivorship. And one important aspect that we should remember is that things have changed a lot over the past century for predators as well. So we have, 10 to 15 times as many sea lions as there were in the 50s, massively more numbers of seals, humpback whales. And the point here is just that predators matter, and we need to think about these predators in terms of where different species are going to be as well. And this is hard mostly because we don't have a lot of really good spatial information, particularly historically information, about where and when different predators are. So that's a very brief overview, sort of intro. And we're going to talk about 3 main groups of species. So I'm going to be talking about salmon today, particularly fall Chinook salmon. Eric's going to be talking about some recent work with groundfish, and then Elliot's going to be talking about large pelagics at the end. And one of the emphasis here is that these are 3 information about distributions, but they make use of very different kinds of data and are applied in very different contexts. And so hopefully this will give you a flavor of the different kinds of information that can be used to inform distributional shifts and how things might change in the future with the changing climate.
So, Ollie, can you hit the swap display button at the top real quick?
Hit the what?
We're all seeing the presenter mode, not the presentation.
There you go.
Yeah.
Boom. Is that better?
Perfect. Thank you.
Sorry about that, everybody. And yeah, Chinook. So this is some work that's going on, collaboration between the Northwest and the Southwest Fishery Science Center. And we all know that Chinook are a big deal for coastal and riverine systems in the Northwest and the West Coast in general. They're important for fisheries. They matter for interactions among fish species. They're prey for important things like southern resident killer whales. And as we're going to emphasize in this talk, they're sort of responsive to various climate drivers. So I am going to sort of run through 3 aspects of Chinook distributional stuff. One is sort of the basic question of where are Chinook in the ocean and look at different stocks along the West Coast. I'm going to sort of show you some preliminary work on how abundance and distribution have changed in the past and what they might look like in the future. And then very briefly, we'll have one slide on how we might connect this to various fisheries and ecosystem type problems for management. This slide is just here to remind me that this does not occur in a vacuum, and there's a lot of really good work that's been going on for years about distributions for various Chinook stocks, including Laurie Whitecamp's work, Will Satterthwaite's work, and of course the Pacific Salmon Commission's work. I'm going to be talking about work based on coded wire tags. So this is a big integrated model that uses a lot of tag data over a lot of years. It is, in this case, pretty much entirely reliant on fisheries data. So you have to worry about where fisheries are occurring and account for the various biases that come from when and where fisheries occur. And I'm going to tell you mostly about California and Columbia River fish. An important point here is because we're relying on fisheries, we have to worry about where the fisheries and how intense the fisheries are how is that affecting where you see fish getting picked up in the ocean. So here is a time series for a whole bunch of commercial troll fishing data from California down here in the south, all the way up to northern southeast Alaska in the north. And essentially, red means there's a lot of fishing going on. Warm or cooler colors means there's less fishing. And so you can see all sorts of changes in the timing and location of commercial fishing through time. For example, you can see a big California fishing closure right here in the late 2000s. You see a similar one here in the mid-90s in Canada, and the closure of the Strait of Georgia troll fishery in the early 90s. So you need a big model here to deal with a lot of variability in where people are looking for fish. Just for two quick examples of what this kind of data looks like. So here's some fish that were released in the Sacramento River in the early 80s, and you have through time here, and then where they were caught. And so bright colors mean a lot of them were caught, and black means none were caught, right? So you can see this for this California stock, the fish are primarily caught in the south. Same plot over here, but for some Snake River fish, fall, Chinook, and these guys are caught all over mostly the northern areas, but also in the south. So that's just sort of the basic data. And from this kind of information, we can come up with, well, what is the expected distribution of fish for, in this case, the Central Valley Chinook? And in the same kind of plot where you have south to north here, and then this is more frequent and less frequent on the x-axis here. And so for this particular stock, you can say, well, most of these California fish on an average year in the summer are caught or are present down in California, with some in Oregon, a few in Washington, and a few lost California fish are up in Canada. We can make similar kinds of plots for a whole suite of other species, other suite of runs. So this is for the Central Valley I just showed you. This is for the Klamath Trinity fish. This is for Lower Columbia, Upper Columbia, right? And if we put on our little dashed lines again, you can show pretty strongly that this is not news to anybody, but different stocks are in different parts of the ocean, and where they are is relatively predictable. And that's it's pretty interesting, and it also means that fisheries in different places are going to have disproportionate impacts on different kinds of stocks. So that's nice for an average ocean. And we can just ask this basic question: do these distributions change if you have a different sea surface temperature? So just to show you what temperatures look like along the coast. So this is sort of from the south here to the north. It's warm in the south in the winter, and it gets progressively colder as you go north. That's not a real surprise to anybody. And there's differences among years. So 2008 is here in blue. It's a particularly cold year. The red one is 1997, which is sort of just before the El Nino kicked in that year. So it's a relatively warm year. Interestingly, if you go in the summer, you actually get this sort of different pattern where north is not always colder, right? So you have this warm water down in the south. There's a sort of a cool trough here in Northern California, and then it gets warm again up off the Columbia in Northern Oregon, and then back down to cool. So there's a lot of sort of not intuitive variability, but this is sort of upwelling, really. Also, in this case, you have a huge difference between a very cold year and a very warm year. Again, this is 97 and 2008. And we can look at that variation among years through time, and we can say, well, here's the late 70s to 2016, again, from the south in Monterey all the way to Alaska. And if you look at this, this is temperature deviation. So red means above average for that particular area. You can pick out clear spots that are unusually and extravagantly warm, right? So these are the two big El Ninos, 83, 97, and the warm blob over here. And you can also pick out particularly cold years, right? So the early 90s and 2008. And using estimates from these models, you can make projections for what does the distribution look like in one of these exceptionally warm years for the Central Valley, California fall Chinook stock here. So this is what the projected distribution looks like for 97. This is what it looks like for 2008. And you can squint at those two and sort of do the, compare them by eye. I prefer to look at them by overlaying them. And so you have, again, from south to north, and the sort of purple area is where they overlap, and any spot that has more blue showing than red means there's more in a cold year than a warm year. And this is the opposite. So there's more red showing, it means that there's more red in that area than a cold year. And so just comparing these 2 years, you can come up with sort of predictions for how Chinook would shift. And what's interesting here is they don't just go north, right? So in a warm year, more Chinook are showing up from the Central Valley up in Washington, Northern Oregon, the Columbia. There's actually quite a substantial number fewer around the California-Oregon border. And then there's a bunch more in the far south. And this is related to that trough of temperature, of cool temperatures in sort of Mendocino area. So that's one for the Central Valley. You can do similar things for this example, the Upper Columbia. And again, here it's not quite as dramatic, but fish do pretty much go north. So there's more red up here in this northern Canada Chinook. Not that big a effect, but it's there, about 3 or 4%. And then there's fewer fish that are available in the summer off of the Washington coast. You can make these same kinds of plots for all sorts of different regions. And you can stare at these for a while, and I'm happy to take questions on them. But the big point is, in general, these fish do shift north when it's warm, south in cool years. There are plenty of exceptions, though. For example, that Central Valley stock that I showed you. Also, for me, it's surprising that these magnitude of distributional shifts is actually not that large. They're relatively modest. And I think it's sort of surprising, and it sort of indicates that they are relatively sticky in where they end up spatially. Where this work is going is trying to make these similar models for a whole suite of Chinook stocks, and hoping to try and come up with things like this, where you say, well, can I make a prediction for anywhere I go along the West Coast, from California to Southeast Alaska? If I go out into the ocean and I pick up a fish, can I identify where that fish is from? So in Southeast Alaska, you have different colors associated with different fish stocks, and you say, well, what's the probability I get a fish from, the Upper Columbia, which is this dark blue? And I can compare that to what's going on in Monterey, where this this sort of yellow mustard color is San Francisco Bay, and the other colors are different stocks. And then we can come up with, across all these stocks, what does the distribution look like for total abundance for this stock? For all fall Chinook in this case. Another really important thing is coming up with information about, incorporating information about climatic effects on survivorship, not only where they are in the ocean, and so that's a big deal as well. Finally, I only showed you summer information, but you can also make similar kinds of plots for different seasons, and I'm happy to talk about that as well. So that's sort of a brief, probably too fast summary of things on Chinook salmon. And I'm going to turn it over to Eric, and he's going to talk about some different work with groundfish.
Thanks, Oli. For the second part, I'm going to kind of highlight some work that we've been doing for about the last 4 or 5 years at the Northwest Center. This collaborative work with Jim Thorson and Louis Barnett, who are also at the Northwest Center, and Sean Anderson, who is in an assessment job at DFO in the NIMO. And the way I've structured this is kind of into the 3 following pieces. First, discussing kind of why the models we're using matter. Second, focusing a little bit more on associations with habitat and some multi-species modeling that we've done. And then third, look at relationships between climate and some of the forecasting work. So the kind of the status or state of the art of groundfish modeling at the that NOAA has been doing has been rapidly evolving. Prior to about 2012, we were using these strata-based models, and around 2012, we underwent this rapid shift, and we incorporated some new state-of-the-art models that are much more computationally intensive, but also give better predictions. And these spatiotemporal models are really what's being used for all the assessment work that we do, and in addition to some focusing on bycatch and other questions that are also important. And so the old approach that we used to use for including spatial information in groundfish assessments was based on this idea of strata. And so these strata were defined based on either latitude or depth. And so, for example, here we might have a north and a south strata where the fish represent occurrences of a given species and the red dots represent absences, so places where we maybe did a tow and a fish wasn't observed. And these methods work totally great if all of the assumptions are valid. And so one of them, for example, is that the density in each stratum is assumed to be constant. And so the downside of these methods is that they can be sensitive to any shifts in effort or movement of the stock of interest. And just to illustrate what that looks like, so in the original panel on the left, we kind of have equal effort in the north and south areas. And then in the right panel, we've shifted some of that effort and sampled a little bit more intensively in the north area, less in the south. And just by kind of eyeballing the figure on the right, you might conclude a couple things. You might conclude there's more fish in the north than the south. That's definitely possible. There's going to be a change in our uncertainty or our precision, and so we're going to become less precise about stock status in the south. And because we have more samples, we're going to become more precise in the north. And depending on how we quantify this change, we might also conclude that the distribution, the spatial distribution of the stock is shifted north. When in reality, all that's shifted is kind of our underlying effort. So the kind of the simple approach for quantifying this is typically called the center of gravity, and the center of gravity is just a simple weighted average where we average the latitude of each observation or each tow by the catch weight, and so and sum everything up, and then we can use that to track latitudinal shifts through time. And if we applied the center of gravity method in this particular example, we would conclude that this northward movement occurred when it didn't. It's really an artifact of our shift in sampling effort. And so over the last 5 years, what we've shifted to are these spatially explicit models. This is just some simulated data for 12 years. And these models are a little bit different because they explicitly account for the spatial location, the spatial covariance between observations, so that good spots tend to be correlated with good spots and vice versa. Further, we can make assumptions about how the spatial covariation changes through time. So it might be reasonable to assume for some quantities of interest that spatial patterns are totally independent from year to year. But for other quantities, it might be appropriate to assume that there's a memory associated with the year-to-year variation, so that hotspots in good years, hotspots in particular years, tends to be associated with hotspots the next year, for example. So we've done some different comparisons in a few papers, comparing these old strata-based models to the new spatial models that are accounting for that correlation between observations. And here we just have some applications to different species caught in the West Coast groundfish survey, where the red lines represent the estimates from the old strata-based model, and the blue lines represent the estimates from the newer spatiotemporal model. The two things I just wanted to highlight are, if you look at it, the trends from these two models are basically the same. And in some cases, if we focus on an example like short spine in the second row and the last column, we see, let's see if I can use my cursor here. So short spine here, we see that the spatial model in blue gives us better confidence intervals. So we're more precise about the stock status when we use the spatial model and explicitly account for that covariation between observations. You can apply these methods to all kinds of other questions, and so we've applied them to looking at better prediction of extreme spatial events, looking at things like species invasions, looking at species interactions, or questions like density dependence. These are kind of beyond the scope of today's talk, but I'd really just want to focus on applications of these types of models to relationships between groundfish and the environment. So the second part of this is really thinking about incorporating habitat or environmental variation in general. And so Oli and some other collaborators led this effort with an application to dark blotched rockfish in some work in 2014 and the associated essential fish habitat modeling. In this particular example, they used so in addition to the spatial locations, they used depth information and some fine scale habitat information. And what they found was that when that fine scale habitat information is included, we can really improve our estimates of not only the spatial predictions, but our interannual trends. And so another application of this work is thinking about, not only might species be shifting around in space, but in terms of seeking cooler water, they might be shifting their distributions of depth and moving to deeper water. And so you could easily include for those types of interactions in these kinds of models, testing for those effects. And then also thinking about kind of the habitat relationship, I just wanted to highlight a paper that some work that Lewis Barnett and Jim Thorson had done, looking at relationships between rockfish assemblages and biogenic habitat. So this is soft corals and sponges. So they combined data from the trawl survey for 6 rockfish species, 2 thorny heads, and then these structure-forming invertebrates. And this is a useful, looking at kind of the multi-species version of this is useful because you can identify groups of species that tend to co-vary or co-occur, and that's useful because in particular for species that are not terribly well sampled, we can improve our predictions if we're including more data-rich species. So if we look at, for example, the left panel here represents the encounter probability of those multi-species assemblages, and we see kind of this whole group that's loading together in red, for example, are the species that tend to co-occur. So this dark blotch, POP, etc. And we can do the same thing with positive catch rates, and this gives you slightly different information about how those species cluster, but overall it improves our predictions to include all the species together. And when we look at what this means for the spatial predictions, the top row here for each of the species represents what the spatial predictions of density are from the single species model, and the bottom panel represents the same predictions from that multi-species model. And what this illustrates, if we focus on something like dark blotched rockfish, we can see, comparing the top to the bottom, that we get much more precise estimates of fine scale spatial predictions when we're accounting for the co-occurrence between species. So this multi-species framework is useful for looking at relationships between species and habitat. But from Lewis and Jim's work, I think it's also important to understand that this multi-species modeling has some limitations. It's not particularly useful in an assessment framework where we're looking at constructing annual indices of species. They found that this framework adds complexity without the associated improvement in precision. And also, if different species are responding differently to climate, the multi-species model is kind of a wash because it doesn't necessarily improve our predictions if things are not necessarily responding in the same direction. So the last bit of this is focusing on the climate impact, and some follow-up work from a paper that Malin Pinsky and their group did in 2013 that was pretty high profile about the responses of fish communities to climate velocities. And this top panel is from their figure and shows the direction that different communities or populations might be expected to respond under different future climate scenarios. And so if we look at the west coast of the US, for example, contrasted with the northeast coast of the US, species in the northeast are expected to shift northward. And this result on the west coast was that species were projected to shift southward their distribution. So this led to a little bit of head scratching on our part and some follow-up work. But what we were really interested in was the work that Malin had done used kind of the old center of gravity approach, which can where our inference can be confounded by any shift in sampling distribution. So we were interested in whether, if we applied these new spatio-temporal models that we're also using for assessments, whether there are any groundfish species in the California current that exhibit this northward shift, and then whether any species in the California current have increased or decreased their overall occupied ranges. And results from that work suggested some pretty big differences between the old center of gravity approach versus the new spatio-temporal modeling. In that the spatial model suggests that about 7 of the 18 species we looked at had some support for slight increases in northward distribution. And when we really dug into the data, it seems like that the inference that species would be likely to move north from, or move south from Malin's paper was really caused by a greater density of sampling in the trawl survey in southern regions over time. And so that was that's where another example where our inference about change is really driven by a shift in sampling effort. In terms of the latitudinal changes over time, these are the 2 estimates in red from the center of gravity, or the blue here is the center of gravity approach, and the red is the spatial model predictions. We get better estimates from the spatial models in red, and I guess we're also seeing some differences, particularly in the early parts of the time series, for something like we can look at English sole, for example. The estimates from the center of gravity approach in blue is much more variable and bouncing around a lot more versus this prediction from the spatial model in red. The other thing we see is that for some of these species, the year-to-year variation in latitude for both models, the spatial model and the center of gravity model, is highly variable. So if we look at something like hake or spiny dogfish, both model estimates are really bouncing around a lot year to year. So last, thinking about the question of range contraction, have any of these species, in addition to shifting their distribution, have any of them contracted their ranges? And so what we did was we estimated the area occupied, and so this is the log of that on the y-axis. And what we see is that for some species, we see a decrease in area occupied, particularly for something like, you can see this declining trend for something like dark blotched rockfish, green striped rockfish, sharp chin rockfish, and possibly this is driven by reduced density of these species in the more southern part of their area or their range. So that's kind of the overview of the groundfish responses to these climate changes, and I'm going to pass it now to Elliot to wrap up the groundfish part and then move on to other species.
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to present a little bit of ongoing work that Becca Selden and Jamil Samori are helping co-lead, looking at extending this range shift information, combining it with biomass to look at basically availability of groundfish to West Coast communities. So you can see the suite of ports on the left side being considered. And the first plot you'll see here is just a log biomass time series where you can see some species like short spine thorny head have a slight decline. Sablefish is one that has probably the more notable decline, with a dip in and then recovery a bit for both lingcod and petrale sole from these models. Next. So now this is looking, if you can just click one more time next, at the general northward movement of these stocks as well. And you can see some patterns coming out here. It's quite noisy. There's a lot of interannual variability, but lingcod are generally have a northward shifting pattern. In addition, Dover sole are kind of in that same boat, with petrale sole and sablefish kind of showing opposite trends. It's essentially slight southward movement, and this could be somewhat of a function of the survey methodology, or also, in addition, there's some response of the fish as well. So next slide. So the work that they've done is then looking by port at basically what is the stock availability, taking essentially the multiplication of the center of gravity times the biomass to see how available some of these species are going to be to these various ports. So you can see Coos Bay there in the north in black, Fort Bragg in purple, and then Morro Bay there in gray. And you can see that for some of the species, particularly things like sablefish, that I mentioned there was a decline, but there may have actually been a little bit of a mask there of the decline in the southern part of the range, as you can see in the gray time series, where even though there might be a decline in biomass slightly, the shift kind of makes up for that, or essentially masks it. But lingcod, in the northernmost port, experienced the largest increase in biomass in the latter part of the time series, which was kind of corresponding to this almost additive effect of the increase in regional biomass combined with a northward movement of the stock. So this is just to give an idea kind of where some of those range shift data can be extended to look more into coastal communities as well. Next slide. I'm now going to shift over to talking more about pelagic species, and there's some examples of fish species here, but really focusing in addition on a lot of the protected species that under the Marine Mammal Protection Act and Endangered Species Act were also required to manage as well. So next slide. I was fortunate when I came in here, I was able to help out with a very large tagging project that was in its wrap-up phase. So I was able to come in and help a bit with the analysis. And one of the advantages of tag data is that the animals tend to go wherever they want to go. But the counterpoint to that is these kind of data can often be very difficult to use in stock assessment, typical stock assessment methodologies, because they're not normally and regularly sampled. So what we were doing here is using this suite of tag data over 23 different species, 4,000 tags, 1 million profiles, 1.1 million, I think was close to the final number, from the entire Northeast Pacific. And so I'm going to focus just on those areas in the next few slides. So next slide. Instead of looking again specifically at abundance, what we did is we were instead interested in what factors determine whether an area is a particular hotspot. So from these tag data, we were able to identify a number of hotspots. The two that kind of came out the strongest were the transition zone in the kind of the center there, right around 42 degrees north, and then the California current along our coast. And it's important to say, without going into too much of the methods, there was a lot of work done to ensure that tag bias wasn't enough factor in these final maps, by basically just throwing out the first 5 through 30 days of the track to make sure it was sufficiently moved offshore. But the little inset images below give an idea for some of the species we're talking about to see which ones are kind of making up which of those habitats. Things like bluefin tuna in blue and elephant seals are two that use both the California current and the transition zone heavily. Then you also have white sharks, I think, next, moving over to the sooty shearwater, leatherback sea turtles, and then blue whales on the right. So then zooming in, the reason I show this is just simply that, we have the hottest of the hotspots right here off of our coast. So next slide. After a number of statistical models we built to try to look at what the physical factors were, I'll just jump right to the point that we found that sea surface temperature was really important in structuring the habitat. So these hotspots tended to fall within a certain range of sea surface temperature values. But then the chlorophyll A, essentially the primary productivity, the bottom-up input to the system, was what really influenced use. So the more productivity there was, the more species and more individuals you would have using a specific grid cell. We were also fortunate that these two variables were available in some of the global climate models that came out in one of the most recent runs. So you can go ahead and click forward again. And so we could use sea surface temperature and chlorophyll to predict a historical period and then the change predicted out to 2100. So what's shown here in areas of orange to red are areas where essentially species gained habitat, and the areas of light green to blue are areas where species lost habitat. So you can see the peak here is about 3 species gaining habitat, with about the trough being about 3 species losing habitat. And if you just do one more quick click, it should just animate. What we saw in the winter in particular is there was this kind of northward movement of the transition zone, kind of core transition zone habitat, where you have species that were further south were essentially moving north as the subtropical gyre expands. But then in summer, there was a particularly noticeable that there wasn't really this kind of recovery of species habitat. There was just kind of a loss in transition zone habitat that may indicate there might be some east-west linkages broken by some of the species that require on this trans-Pacific migrations. So the next slide. And the other thing we can do is we can start to make some sort of kind of first guesses at which species are likely to feel pressure from climate change effects on their pelagic habitat. So this is not a time series of abundance or a prediction of how the species are going to respond directly to climate change, but it's saying instead, what are the predicted changes in available habitat for each of the guilds or each of the species we're looking at out to 2100, to give it almost a triage approach to start to identify what are those species that are likely to face climate change pressure in the upcoming years. One of the important points that came out, I think, also in Mike's talk, and you can see it with the sea turtles at the top right, is that in some cases there's a good bit of noise, depending, and it takes a while for some of the effects to kick in to get actually beyond the intrinsic variability in the system out to about 2040 before you actually get to ranges where you're outside of that kind of interannual, or in this case actually seasonal variability. So some of these things are these animals are already experiencing a good deal of variability, but we are showing, or at least predicting, that with these shifting baselines, they're likely to face additional high stress situations due to low habitat in the future. So we can go ahead and I think click forward to the next slide. The other point I want to make from this is, again, it's we're not expecting that there will be a very slow linear change as was shown in those previous habitat graphs, but instead that there'll be more of these kind of extreme events and previously what I'm calling unforeseen consequences. So this is an example that is probably very familiar to all of us, that we have the starving sea lion pups in California. As Ole pointed out at the beginning, this is definitely in part due to just the sheer recovery of the population. There's a lot more sea lions now than there used to be, but at the same time, when conditions get bad in Southern California, you see this huge migration up to the Columbia River. So that's what this graph is showing, is that when conditions were bad in the south, the animals move further north, which could increase their interaction with endangered salmon, could lead to more interaction with fishing gear and haul out on anthropogenic habitat or on human built structures. So just another point that with these changing conditions, we're likely to see more of these kind of previously unforeseen consequences. So another example on the next slide is for the recent increase in entanglements we've been seeing for humpback whales in some of the fixed gear pots. And I really want to talk through this. Again, this isn't a long-term prediction, but it's a really good example of how both changes in human fishing communities or fishing patterns combined with changes in a species distribution and population can result in these new unforeseen consequences. Even though we have a suite of management requirements in place, still we can't always predict for the unknown. So on the right is just showing patterns of anchovy, where you can see in 2013-14 there were not very many anchovy near shore, but 15-16 you can really see the spike, particularly in Central California and right off my backyard here in Monterey as well, where anchovies were much more dense, much more aggregated. So this persistent marine heat wave that we heard talked about previously, you can click through once, led to this record harmful algal bloom with domoic acid, which resulted in a delayed opening for the Dungeness crab fishery. It did also have some negative effects on some of the marine mammals in the system, but I'm not going to focus on that part of it. Next. The marine heat wave also was partially responsible for this low krill abundance off the shelf break, with a high increased concentration of anchovies on the shelf, essentially being pushed closer to shore by the warm water. Next slide. The recovering whale populations are definitely part of this. We have whales likely expanding into historical niches that they have not been seen in recent years. And then this humpback whale prey switching, and one last click for this one, resulting in this unusual space-time overlap between the large numbers of foraging whales and the crab pots and lines. And I just think this is a very good example. Another aspect that I didn't put in here is apparently with, from this workshop that Jared has participated in, that the increase also in Dungeness crab fishing was also a result of the decline of salmon. So if there's a very good salmon year, you might actually have less effort on, in terms of crab fishing as well. So less of a kind of risk towards entanglement here as well. So there really are a suite of kind of trigger points that lead to this unusual overlap, and trying to get out ahead of it and figure out where we might be more likely to see these unforeseen consequences is, I think, one thing with species distribution models we can start to do. So one more slide, I'll just talk about another example that's not our coast, but this isn't just isolated to the West Coast. The North Atlantic right whale mortalities, I would argue, as far as particularly for spatial and gear protection for right whales, they are critically endangered, and it has been one of the most, I would say, heavily and successfully regulated populations of whales in North America. But what happened is, as their food, these diapods and copepods, shifted up into Canadian waters where the whales were not usually seen in high abundance, all of a sudden there was this increased kind of risk for right whales in this new habitat. And this is not meant to be a Canada versus US thing, obviously, but it's just a problem that was not seen in their waters in the past, but is now becoming quite real for them. So one last slide, I think. I just want to put in the plug that I think one of the things that we are hoping to do as part of the integrated ecosystem assessment is try to come up with some of these new tools. The example here, hopefully everyone has heard me blab on about it in the past, but EcoCast is one of these such tools where we are trying to track ocean features to give information on target catch and bycatch in near real time to essentially increase opportunities for fishing, but also decrease some of these harmful interactions. So I think the more we can start looking at some of these novel solutions and come up with ways to disentangle, pun intended, the risk and reward essentially we're trying to get, I think the more successful we will be towards these species distribution shifts in the future. And I think that is all I have.
Great. Yeah, I think we're all done. We're happy to take questions if there are any.
Okay, thanks for the presentation. I guess just to start, I'll turn it back over to Yvonne to see if start with any questions or comments that the ecosystem work group members want to make, and then we can go on to anybody else that's on the call. So Yvonne, do you have anything to start with?
Great, thank you. That was a great talk. I really appreciated all the effort that went into that. I mean, you covered a lot of different species, and I'm sure there's a lot of people on the call who are just trying to absorb it all. I'm going to ask a question, and then I want to turn it over to Josh Lindsay, who actually is our rapporteur today. I was incorrect in thinking that Corey was going to do it. Josh stepped in. So this was part of the talk about the distribution of groundfish. I was curious. So first, thank you for thinking so carefully about distribution, but the groundfish distribution information, did I hear correctly, is that coming from the trawl survey? And so it looked like the data for that goes, you had, the information goes back to 1980-ish, is that correct? And if so, what I'm thinking about and wondering about is, we had a lot of overfishing going on off our coast from mid-20th century fishing by European, particularly Soviet fisheries, and then a big decline in a lot of our groundfish species up through about the turn of the century. And then we've been in this rebuilding period for the last 20-ish years. So I'm sort of curious if you've been talking with the stock assessment scientists about some thoughts about the influence of the management regime on distribution of these different species.
Yeah, that's a really good question. For the work that we're looking at these the groundfish, all the data is coming from the trawl surveys that that the Northwest Center or Science Centers in general have done on the west coast of the U.S. And in terms of thinking about the impacts of fishing mortality, that's something that Lewis is following up on quite a bit more now. It's something that Jim's also done some work on in terms of thinking about you know, have harvest affected the distribution. More recently, there was some work that Kotaro Ono did a couple years ago, looking at for Dover sole, whether we could detect the impact of fishing mortality between different passes of the trawl survey. And so there's an early summer pass and a late summer pass with fishing in between. And we could basically detect no influence of that summer fishing, potentially because of just movement of the stock within the year. And so it's something that we continue to work on with the assessment group. Oli or Elliot might have more to add.
Yeah, I guess my only other thought is part of the reason we only use the survey data primarily is because where and when some of those historical fishing activities occurred by the Soviet fleet or other folks is not, to my knowledge, really well documented, or it's documented in very big boxes in the ocean. And so trying to suss out small scale or medium scale shifts in distribution from really aggregated data is very tricky. So I think it's a great question, and it'd be super cool if we could dig up some information that would help us there, but I'm not sure it's going to actually be possible.
I wasn't sure it was possible either. It's just sort of interesting, but what's interesting is not always possible. Okay, so then I would turn it over to Josh and anyone else on the ecosystem work group. And if you're a member of the public or other temple advisory bodies, maybe write down your question, and so we can queue it up when we get to that question period. Anyone else from the work group?
This is Cerise, and I had a question. It was kind of related to Yvonne's, and but in terms of other information that you might look at relative to the changes in distribution, say, of the pelagics group, I was wondering if you had plans to look at perhaps changes in distributions of prey for the species, in particular the large pelagics that move fairly far and frequently along the West Coast, if you were planning to kind of marry those changes in distributions up. It's sort of extending your anchovy whale cycle to other groups of species.
Yeah, so this is Elliot. I completely agree. I mean, one of the reasons we tend to use sea surface temperature and chlorophyll is that it is, you know, globally sensed on a daily time step for the entire ocean. I guess globally implies that too. But the problem is we still just don't have prey often at the prey data at the resolution that we need to inform some of these species habitat models. I will say we're in the process now, though, of trying to build a mechanistic model that actually will be trying to recreate patterns of prey, particularly in, you know, times when surveys are not, you know, in being run, to inform these kind of higher trophic level models. So, you know, I think that is kind of a good way forward and the best we can do. But I really am always looking forward or looking for the next, you know, kind of tool we can get at to say, you know, not just where are the prey, you know, relative to Monterey, but, you know, entirely up and down the California current, you know, multiple times a month. But I'll probably be holding my breath a little bit of, you know, quite a while on that one, unfortunately.
Yeah, thanks, Elliot. And I want to echo what Yvonne said about the, you know, presentation. It was quite excellent, and as she said, so much to think about here. Yeah.
Hey, this is Ken. I saw that Richard Scully, you had your hand up, and you can go ahead, and also Deb had hers up too. So after Richard, if you have a question or comment, so go ahead, Richard.
Thank you. Going back to the first part of your presentation on Chinook salmon, and I observed, like everyone else did, that the changes in distribution based on whether it was 1997, which was a cooler year, or 2008, which was a warmer year, were noticeable. You could tell where changes had occurred, but it was a very small percentage. And so it looked like, and I don't know if 1997, how comparable that was to the recent 2015-16, where we had perhaps much warmer water. But anyway, my point, or where I'm going with this, is I'm guessing that you can tell which stock, whether it's Upper Columbia or Washington coast or wherever, the origin, you're getting that from either coated wire tags or pit tags, some identification, probably not genetics, but I'm not sure of that. But were you able to, or look at whether the fish were wild or hatchery based on adipose fin clips or the tags to see if there's any difference in how wild and hatchery fish respond to those temperature changes? I remember from either last webinar or the one before, one of you were talking about the synchronous nature of the hatchery Chinook stocks. Maybe not a lot of variation. Maybe, I don't know whether it's genetic variation or behavioral, to where maybe they might not respond. The hatchery fish might not respond as quickly to changes in the environment as would wild fish. So, in a nutshell, I'm just wondering if wild fish have a better chance to deal with changes in the environment and with climate change than the hatchery fish. Thanks.
Yeah, well, this is Oli. It's a great question. It's more than a $10 million question. It's the main. So to back up, these are all based on tagged fish, and down here in the southern U.S., almost all tagged fish are hatchery fish. There's like 5 fish that are wild and tagged every year, but not a whole lot more than that. So the short answer is we don't really know the difference between hatchery and wild fish. The assumption under many of the fisheries management models is that the coated wire or the hatchery fish do things very similar to the stocks that they were derived from originally. So that's an assumption. There's good reason to think they're not identical, but that's the basic assumption. The other side of that, so all of this information is from hatchery fish, short version. It's a great question about whether wild fish are different. We don't have any real good. The only other information that's out there that needs to be integrated is from the genetic stock identification work that's gone on up and down the coast for the past 10 or 15 years, in which they sample both wild and hatchery released, and they say, where did this fish come from using its DNA? And big picture, the genetic stock identification stuff, like the answers we get for the hatchery fish. So I don't think they're wildly different, but it's a very good question, and I think it's going to be an important one going forward. So a project that Eric and I and other folks are working on right now is trying to integrate that genetic information into these coded wire tag based distribution models, and how do you make them better, or what do they tell you that's different? But we're certainly thinking about that. I'm afraid I don't have a real good answer for the moment.
Thank you.
Deb, did you have a question? I think you were next.
Maybe while Deb's getting her question together, I'll ask a quick one. This is Josh.
Please do.
So this is, and Elliot can chime in here too, but it's mainly for maybe Oli and Eric, and it's related to Elliot's answer to Theresa's question. But I was curious for the two of you, on both your talks, you talked about sort of the, for lack of a better word on my part, pros and cons of the approaches and the modeling that you're doing, or the increases in uncertainty that perhaps they've created at times. And so I was just curious for both of you in terms of where you see the biggest gains happening in terms of next steps of the work. Is it data collection? Is it better modeling? And where do you see us going in terms of into the future for both of these?
So this is Eric. I think in terms of modeling, we've made the majority of the gains in modeling have been kind of the work on the assessment side in terms of applying these new spatial models. I think that the gains in terms of the modeling that we can do in the future to improve those would be some slight tweaking, but not result in large gains in efficiency. And so these are gains in prediction of 10% or something pretty small. We are doing some things to better model some of these extreme events and anomalies. I think that one of the gains that we could do is probably include more of the multi-species modeling and do that for a greater range of species from the groundfish data. So that's something that we can do. And then from incorporation of more data, I think incorporation of more of the habitat data, similar to the EFH work that Oli's been involved in, would also improve those predictions, I think, quite a bit. So those are great. From the trawl survey data, we also have things like bottom temperature that we're trying to include as covariates or dissolved oxygen or some of these other factors that are being collected in the sample. Any of that information, like Elliot's talk, in terms of the fine scale climate or fine scale environmental data, would improve these predictions too. So that's where I see the most gains probably. Oli can probably add to that.
Yeah, I think for the groundfish, I'm pretty right on the same page with Eric. For the salmon side of things, it's hard. Mostly, it's sort of trying to collate historical data for salmon that are swimming, thousands of kilometers and moving between jurisdictions and Canada, U.S., Alaska, Washington, tribal management. It's sort of corralling all of that data held by different people is a real hassle, and it takes a long time. And so one of the things that we're hoping to do in the near term is look at sort of try and bring in more bycatch information from trawls in Alaska, trawls on the West Coast, and try and leverage that kind of information to think about distribution. There's also this really cool stuff that Pete Lawson has done over the years with both genetic stock identification stuff, but also fine scale, where are these salmon relative to seamounts and sort of habitat features. So that's sort of the essential fish habitat kind of thing applied to salmon. The big thing, it's hard to imagine getting more information than the coded wire tag database at this point, because that's, billions of tags deployed over 40 plus years. And, you need that kind of historical information to think about how they interact with climate, right? So it's kind of hard to beat that. The problem is going back to even the sea surface temperature data only goes back to the early 80s, and when the first satellite showed up. So if you go back into the 70s, it's hard to get fine scale information on temperatures and other things coastwide. So that sort of, it's trying to corral data in a sort of a slightly new way or a twist on what other people have done previously is the main gains. And it just takes a long time, unfortunately. And I would love to incorporate more information on predators as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk. We just don't have a whole lot of spatial information about predators. I'd love to incorporate information about prey, like the question earlier, but we don't have a whole lot of information historically about prey. So if those things are hiding in somebody's drawer, I would love to know about them. Please give me a call. But I don't think they exist. And so the question is, how do you deal with these gaps? And that's a modeling question, but also just something we have to live with.
Well, I'll also add to the, on the salmon side of things, this is Eric again, to what Oli said. I think one of the challenges we're coming up against is almost all of our knowledge about salmon ocean distribution is coming from fisheries catches of these tagged fish. And if we look at kind of the duration of the salmon fishing season back in the 70s or early 80s versus what it is today, it's definitely shrunk throughout the year. And so we're sampling over a much smaller window. We're collecting fewer samples. So in some ways our data collection is going down. In an ideal world, we would be out doing test fisheries on different parts of the coast, for example, and applying GSI or genetic stock identification methods to identify where those fish were originating from. But that's just not practical, I think. So, yeah.
Yeah, I'll just add one quick thing other than beating home the data point. The other thing is, for a lot of these climate, for at least the prediction side, we have a suite of physical models to rely on, and we're in the process now of building multiple different types of kind of biological to ecosystem models as well. So I think that's an area, hopefully over the next 5 years, we're going to have a lot of growth to be able to produce ensembles on the biological, ecological, ecosystem side, the same way we do for a lot of our physical kind of IPCC class models.
Thanks. I appreciate all the sort of candid answers on that.
That was a nice high point to end on. Josh, thanks for bailing me out while I was trying to get myself off mute. Can you guys hear me now?
Definitely.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, great. So I was really struck during the groundfish portion about the challenges of trying to tease out movement, latitudinal movement from movement due to depth changes, due to moving inside or deeper or whatever it is. And what kind of struck me was the complication of every time I turn around, it seems like you hear about a new study to look at genetic differences in speciation in rockfishes. And I was wondering how that plays into the bigger picture of where you're trying to interpret results for groundfish.
I guess this is Eric. I guess I would probably defer to any of the assessment folks on that, just because we're I guess all of our information from the trawl surveys have species identification that's generally based on visual observations. If there's speciation occurring or hybridization, I think I'm not really sure how those kind of cases are handled.
Yeah, it's a tricky one. I know that over the course of the survey that they've combined or split several groups, and how they deal with that, in the assessments, I am not fully knowledgeable. You just sort of, as a modeler, that sort of gets tossed into the, what do we do about it? Let's make an error term. Like approach, yeah, I don't really have. It's one of those sort of intractable things, I know they have similar kinds of problems for historical catches where they say, the catch in the early '80s was classified as rockfish, right? And so trying to parse out what is that same sort of problem, and either you find somebody really clever who's figured out something really special to do in particular cases, or you do your best and hope it works, which is sort of all you can do in a lot of cases like that.
Thanks.
Does anyone else from the work group have any questions? Okay. If you're a member of the public or you're from another council advisory body, I think the way this process works is that you press the little hand raising sign on the GoToMeeting controls, and Kit gives you permission to speak or unmutes you. So Kit, is there anyone, would you mind managing from here and see if there's anyone who's interested in asking a question?
Yeah, I don't see any hand raised yet, but we can hang around for a little while, see if anybody gets inspired. So, okay, Debbie Hazelton-Nielsen, you're off mute if you have a question.
Yes, hi. I was just curious, thinking of the groundfish and the plots I was seeing, and the information that's coming from the trawl data. Are you imagining that most of this is in response to increased recruitment and productivity and the temperatures that way, versus actually adult fishes that are moving north or south, depending on what the temperatures are and the conditions?
That's a good question. I think for the purposes of what I showed, we're not trying to disentangle recruitment from movement, but those things are things that I think we have the data to dive into that further. We have some age-specific information for a lot of these, especially the rockfish samples, where individuals have been collected in the trawl survey, for example, have been aged, and so one of the ongoing things we're looking at is whether we can do some similar spatial modeling with specific age classes to look at whether that recruitment is how that's variable year to year, and then whether that's responding to any changes in the environment, or whether it's temperature or other factors. So that's something that's definitely a high priority and something we're currently looking at. Oli, do you have any other?
No, I know this is it's very interesting and potentially very productive area. It's trying to think about age structure in space. So, for example, you could make a model where you have a distribution for age 5 fish, and then sort of a different kind of model for age 6 fish, and you can build a structure like that. Unfortunately, it's very computationally hard, and generally speaking, there aren't all that many samples. So when you start subdividing your population into finer and finer slices, like each age class or whatever, your data requirements sort of go through the roof. And so there's a lot of interest in doing it. It's probably the case that for a lot of species, it's going to be very hard. There are instances, relatively abundant species with lots of age data, that it's going to work out and it's going to be possible. But frankly, I don't know of anybody anywhere in the world who's successfully done that yet in a good way. But it's certainly a big, pressing, super interesting question. So that's sort of a punt for our answer, but super great question.
And part of the challenge, of course, is that once you start dealing with spatial variation and kind of the age of a population, you have to deal with the time component, and then you have to start thinking about how either natural mortality varies spatially, or how fisheries mortality or catches vary spatially, and include that too, because that will certainly have an impact on the age structure that we actually observe.
Thank you.
Okay, Kit, do we have any more questions from anyone, members of the public, etc.?
I don't see any. So I guess this is, Richard just raised his hand. Not a member of the public, but go ahead, I guess, Richard.
Well, I just wanted to ask the presenters, as they're gathering all this information and doing all the analyses, are there some sort of conclusions or light bulbs or things that go off in their head about how this information would be useful or best used for management of these fisheries? I mean, any idea what you feel the council would grab a hold of in this presentation and start thinking about better ways, or maybe ways to improve what they're already doing. We, the listeners, we've seen the presentation for an hour and we're thinking about it, but you people have been probably looking at this for months, if not years. Thank you.
I have one quick thing, if I could jump in. The word I would like to use is nimbleness, and I don't think that's going to be doable on every issue. But for example, I know on the East Coast there have been issues with species distribution shifts. Luckily on the West Coast we only have 3 states to deal with, but on the East Coast where you might have a statewide or state-specific quota allocation, and species moves north, all of a sudden it's no longer reachable, by that fishery, and the states up north don't have the quota for it. So I think getting an idea for, where these distributional shifts are likely to hit, management inflexibility, and ways to kind of build some flexibility in there is one thing that I think is going to be critical in years to come.
This is Eric. I also think that focusing on the thinking about the groundfish, any of the range contraction or expansion would probably be a pretty useful output to come out of the groundfish modeling. And I think one of the kind of overlapping themes with the salmon work is just thinking about how these populations are overlapping spatially, either with fisheries or with other ecosystem components like top predators that depend on them, and how those predator-prey relationships are varying over time in relation to climate, for example, would be a useful output.
Yeah, and I think I echo what Eric said. I mean, all of these predictions, I didn't play it up too much in the salmon section, but they are directly changing availability for different ports. And so you'd expect it, for example, to be harder in some places to catch salmon and easier in other places to catch salmon with these climate changes. And so that information should be helpful for when a fisherman says, hey, I'm having great catch rates, there must be a lot of fish out there. It might actually just be that there's a higher fraction of fish near that port. And that's an important thing to know, and reason why you might be it's just important information to affect how you manage or how you interpret real-time information that's coming in, or seasonal information that's coming in. So yeah, I think that's it for me.
Okay, well, if there are no more questions, that was actually a good transition comment. Does anyone have any other questions? All right.
Not seeing any more hands, right?
Sorry, Kit, what did you say?
Oh, I just was saying no more hands raised.
Okay, so thank you everyone for attending. I want to give you a little note for what's up next. So in this webinar series, this is number 3 of 4, and the 4th webinar in this series is occurring next Tuesday, February 27th, and it is from our social scientists. It's about state and federally managed fishery participation under different climate scenarios. And that one is also at 1:30, and again, it's on Tuesday, the 27th. Now, perhaps confusingly, the Ecosystem Work Group is also meeting on Monday, the 26th. And the purpose of our meeting is to give members of other advisory bodies and the public a briefing on the Climate and Communities Initiative as a whole. So, and also to brief folks on our Ecosystem Work Group report that's in the March briefing book under agenda item F2A. So, if you've been following along in this webinar series, the discussion on the 26th, Monday, might not be all that exciting for you. However, if you'd like an overview of where the initiative might be going and some of our suggestions for the council for future schedules, we'll talk about that on Monday. But again, if you're more interested in following on the webinar series and hearing sort of what's next and where all of the stuff we've been talking about in the first 3 webinars come together for where fishermen are operating and landing different species, then that's going to be on Tuesday the 27th. I hope that makes sense. And both of these webinars are up on the council's website. Does anyone have any further questions or clarifications before we close? Okay, well, I just want to thank you guys again, Eric, Oli, Elliot, for your presentations and for collaborating with all of your colleagues to put together such a great giant pile of information for us to think about. It was wonderful and a worthy follow-up to the first 2 presentations, which were also awesome. And I hope that we get a chance to see everyone on Tuesday. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.